She gave her last dollar to a homeless stranger, thinking she had lost everything. She didn't know. She just saved the most dangerous man in Seoul. Meet Nia. She works 14 hours a day scraping plates for a manager who hates her. Her rent is overdue. Her bank account is empty. She is one mistake away from living on the streets herself. But today, she makes a choice that changes history. She sees a homeless man shivering in the alley, cold, starving, invisible to everyone else. She is hungry too, but she looks at her sandwich and hands it to him. She says, "Take this, you need it more than me." She thinks he is nobody, but watch his eyes closely. The moment she walks away, the trembling stops. The homeless man is gone, the mafia king has awakened. Now, let's get started. The steam rising from the dishwater did nothing to warm the chill in Nia's bones. For 14 hours, she had been a ghost in the bustling kitchen of Gred's diner, scraping half-eaten burgers into the trash while her own stomach twisted in violent, empty knots. "Faster, Nia. You think I pay you to daydream." Mr. Gred's voice was like a whip crack. Nia flinched, dropping a fork into the suds. She didn't look up. She couldn't. If she looked at him, she might cry, and crying was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Sorry, Mr. Gred," she whispered, scrubbing harder until her knuckles turned raw. When her break finally came, it wasn't a reprieve, it was a reality check. She huddled in the back corner near the mop buckets and pulled out her cracked phone. She tapped her banking app, praying for a miracle, a forgotten deposit, anything. Balance, $0. A heavy sigh escaped her lips. Rent was 3 weeks late. Her landlord had already threatened to change the locks. She had exactly one asset left in the world, a warm, foil-wrapped chicken sandwich she had bought with her employee discount. It was supposed to be her dinner for tonight and her breakfast for tomorrow. Clutching the sandwich like it was gold, Nia pushed open the heavy steel door to the back alley. The Seoul winter air hit her instantly, sharp and unforgiving. She pulled her thin cardigan tighter around herself, seeking a quiet corner to eat in peace. That was when she saw him. He was huddled behind a stack of blue recycling bins, a heap of rags that barely looked human. He was shaking, violent, rhythmic tremors that rattled the cardboard he sat on. People walked past the alley mouth constantly, their eyes sliding over him as if he were part of the trash. Invisible. Nia looked down at her sandwich. The heat radiating through the foil felt wonderful against her frozen palms. Her mouth watered. She was so hungry it hurt. She looked back at the man. He wasn't moving enough to stay warm. He was going to freeze tonight. Without letting herself think about the hunger pains that would keep her awake later, Nia walked over. She knelt on the wet pavement, disregarding the grime ruining her tights. "Hey," she said softly. The man flinched. He looked up, his face hidden beneath a matted hood and layers of dirt. But his eyes, dark, intense, and strangely alert, locked onto hers. "I'm not going to hurt you," Nia murmured. She extended the foil-wrapped package. "It's chicken, it's warm, take it." The man stared at the food, then at her. He didn't speak. He just reached out with a trembling hand. As his fingers brushed against hers to take the sandwich, his grip tightened for a fraction of a second. His skin was rough, but his hand was shockingly warm. "You need it more than me," she said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Stay warm, okay?" She stood up, brushing off her knees, and retreated back into the warmth of the kitchen, her stomach empty but her heart strangely heavy. The heavy steel door clicked shut, sealing Nia back inside her hell. The moment the latch clicked, the trembling in the alley stopped. The man in the rags straightened his spine. The slump of the defeated beggar vanished, replaced by the rigid, predatory posture of an apex predator. He unwrapped the sandwich, not to eat it, but to stare at it as if it were a rare artifact. A sleek, black SUV with tinted windows rolled silently to the curb at the mouth of the alley. The rear door flew open, and a man in a crisp suit hurried out, bowing low enough to touch his forehead to the dirty asphalt. "Sir," the subordinate whispered, terrified, "we have secured the perimeter." The beggar stood up. He tossed the hood back, revealing sharp, aristocratic features and eyes that burned with a cold, calculating intelligence. Kim Tae-Sook, the dragon of the north, looked at the steel door where the waitress had disappeared. He brought a hidden earpiece to his lips. "Cancel the search," Tae-Sook said, his voice deep and smooth, carrying the weight of absolute command. "I found her." Nia stepped back into the grease-heavy air of the kitchen, the metallic taste of adrenaline still sharp on her tongue. She expected the usual chaos of the dinner rush, but instead, she walked into a wall of silence. The other cooks were staring at their shoes. The dishwasher, a boy named Min-jun who usually hummed K-pop songs, was aggressively scrubbing a pot, refusing to look in her direction. Standing in the center of the aisle, arms crossed over his stained white shirt, was Mr. Gred. His face was a mottled shade of crimson that clashed with the fluorescent lights. "So," he hissed, his voice dangerously low, "the thief returns." Nia froze. "Mr. Gred, I just took my 15-minute break, you said." "I said you could rest," he roared, spit flying from his lips. "I didn't say you could loot my inventory. I saw you, Nia. I saw you take that chicken sandwich out the back door." "I paid for that," Nia stammered, her hands trembling. "It was deducted from my tips yesterday. You watched me write it in the ledger." "Lies." Gred stepped forward, invading her personal space until she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You're stealing food to feed your pathetic habits. Probably selling it, aren't you? Trying to make a quick buck off my hard work." "I gave it away," Nia shouted, the injustice finally snapping something inside her. "I gave it to a starving man in the alley because, unlike you, I have a heart." The kitchen went deathly quiet. Gred stared at her, his eyes bulging. Then a cruel, twisted smile curled his lips. "You gave my food to a rat," he laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Well, that settles it. I don't employ thieves, and I certainly don't employ idiots who feed stray animals with my profits." He snatched the dirty apron from a nearby counter, Nia's spare, and threw it at her. It hit her in the chest with a wet slap, sliding down to the floor. "Get out," Gred spat. "You're done. Don't bother coming back for your paycheck. Consider it payment for everything else you've probably stolen." "But my rent," Nia whispered, the fight draining out of her as terror set in. "Please, I have nowhere else to go." "Not my problem. Get out before I call the police." Nia turned and ran. She pushed through the back door, stumbling out into the night. The weather had turned. The biting wind was now accompanied by a freezing, relentless rain that soaked her thin cardigan in seconds. She stood in the alley, gasping for air, the cold water mixing with the hot tears tracking down her cheeks. She was alone, truly, completely alone. She looked toward the corner where the homeless man had been, desperate for even a silent nod of acknowledgement. Someone, anyone, who wouldn't look at her with hatred. "Sir," she called out over the sound of the rain. The corner was empty. The cardboard was gone. The man was gone. It was as if he had never existed. Nia walked to the spot where he had sat, hugging herself to stop the shivering. There was nothing left of him. Then something caught the glint of the street lamp. Lying in a puddle, untouched by the grime around it, was a cigarette butt. It wasn't the cheap, roll-your-own kind usually found in this part of town. It was distinct, black paper with a filter wrapped in a shining, real gold ring. Nia stared at it, confused. It looked expensive, dangerous. She kicked it aside, burying her face in her hands. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered. The rain poured down, washing away her livelihood, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and the terrifying silence of the city. The walk home felt like a funeral march. Nia's shoes squelched with every step, the icy water seeping into her socks, numbing her toes. She kept her head down, counting the cracks in the pavement, trying to calculate how many days she could survive on $0. Maybe she could sell her phone. Maybe she could pawn her grandmother's necklace, the one she swore she'd never part with. As she rounded the corner to her apartment building, a crumbling brick block that smelled permanently of mildew, her heart stopped. The front door to her unit was wide open, bright. Harsh light spilled out onto the wet sidewalk. And there, piled in a haphazard heap near the gutter, were black plastic trash bags. Nia broke into a run, her fatigue forgot. No, 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 no. A man in a beige raincoat was kneeling at her door, the screech of a power drill cutting through the sound of the rain. It was Mr. Choi, her landlord. "What are you doing?" Nia screamed, grabbing the nearest trash bag. It split open, spilling her clothes, her favorite sweater, her work uniform, her socks, into the muddy water. Mr. Choi didn't even look up. He finished tightening a screw on the new deadbolt and stood, wiping his hands on his pants. "Eviction," he said simply. "I told you last week, Nia, no money, no room." "I was going to pay you," Nia pleaded, her hands shaking as she tried to scoop her muddy clothes back into the bag. "I just needed a few more days. I lost my job tonight, but I can find another one. Please, Mr. Choi, it's freezing. You can't just throw me out in the rain." Mr. Choi laughed, a dry, wheezing sound that made Nia's stomach turn. "I can, and I did. Someone else already put down a deposit. Cash. They move in tomorrow morning." He stepped around her, kicking a stuffed bear, a gift from her sister, out of his path. "Don't be here when I come back to inspect the place, or I call the cops for trespassing." He got into his car and drove away, the red taillights fatting into the gloom. Nia stood alone on the sidewalk. The rain had turned into a deluge, plastering her hair to her skull. She looked at the pile of garbage bags that contained her entire life. It looked so small, so worthless. Her legs gave out. She collapsed onto her hardshell suitcase, the only thing not in a bag. She didn't have the energy to cry anymore. She just sat there, staring blankly at the dark window of the apartment that used to be her home. The cold was no longer just on her skin. It had settled deep in her chest, a heavy, suffocating weight. She was broken. Across the street, parked in the shadows beneath a broken street lamp, a black sedan idled silently. The engine purred, barely audible over the storm. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of expensive leather and faint tobacco. Kim Tae-Sook watched through the tinted glass, his eyes tracking the small, huddled figure shivering on the suitcase. His jaw was set so tight a muscle ticked in his cheek. "Sir," the driver said tentatively, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "Should we intervene now? The men are ready." Tae-Sook didn't blink. He watched Nia wrap her arms around herself, rocking back and forth. He remembered the warmth of the sandwich she had given him. He remembered the kindness in her eyes when she thought he was nothing. He raised a hand, tapping one finger against the glass. "Wait," he commanded, his voice dark and promising violence. "Let her despair. It will make the salvation sweeter, but get the names of the landlord and the diner manager. I want their lives dismantled by morning." "Yes, sir." Tae-Sook leaned back into the shadows, his gaze never leaving Nia. "Soon, little bird," he whispered. "Soon." The streetlights flickered and died, leaving the narrow backstreets of the district plunged into a suffocating darkness. Nia dragged her suitcase over the uneven cobblestones, the wheels rattling like dry bones. Every shadow looked like a monster. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. She had tried the subway station, but the grates were pulled down, locked tight for the night. The 24-hour internet cafe had turned her away the moment they saw her sodden clothes. Now she was just looking for an overhang, a dry patch of concrete, anything to escape the relentless, freezing rain that felt like it was trying to erase her from the earth. She turned down a narrow alleyway, hoping it would lead to a main road. Instead, it dead-ended at a chain-link fence. Nia turned to leave, but the exit was blocked. Two silhouettes stood at the mouth of the alley, backlit by the distant glow of the city. They were big, their postures slouching and predatory. The smell of stale beer and cheap cologne drifted toward her on the wind. "Lost, little lady," one of them drawled. The voice was wet and scratchy. Nia's grip tightened on the handle of her suitcase until her fingers ached. "Please, just let me pass. I don't have any money." "You got a bag," the second man said, stepping closer. He was wearing a hooded jacket, his hands buried deep in the pockets. "People don't drag bags around for fun. What's in there? Jewelry? Laptop?" "It's just clothes," Nia's voice cracked. She took a step back, hitting the fence. "Please." "We'll see about that." They moved in unison, like wolves circling a wounded deer. Nia swung the suitcase in front of her like a shield, but the first man, the one smelling of beer, lunged forward. He kicked the suitcase out of her hand. It skidded across the wet pavement, splashing into a puddle. "No," Nia screamed, diving for it. The hooded man grabbed her arm, jerking her back with bruising force. His fingers dug into her bicep, painful and terrifyingly strong. "Let go of me," she shrieked, thrashing against him. "Shut up or I'll shut you up," he hissed, raising a fist. Nia squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the impact. She waited for the pain. She waited for the end. Instead, the world exploded in white. High beams, brighter than the sun, flooded the alleyway, blinding them all. The roar of a high-performance engine tore through the air, followed by the ear-splitting screech of tires on wet asphalt. The thug holding Nia froze, shielding his eyes with his free hand. What the hell? A sleek, obsidian-black sedan had mounted the curb, blocking the alley entrance completely. It looked like a beast from another world, armored, silent, and deadly. The rear doors opened simultaneously. Two men stepped out. They didn't look like the police. They didn't look like good Samaritans. They wore identical charcoal suits that cost more than Nia's entire life earnings. They were mountains of muscle, standing with a disciplined, terrifying stillness. They didn't shout. They didn't pull weapons. They simply cracked their knuckles, the sound echoing like gunshots in the confined space. The thug holding Nia dropped her arm as if it were burning hot. He looked at the car, then at the men, and realized with dawning horror exactly who and what had just arrived. This wasn't a street fight. This was an execution waiting to happen. "Run," the beer-smelling thug choked out. They didn't hesitate. They scrambled over the chain-link fence, tearing their clothes and slipping on the wet metal in their desperation to get away from the men in the suits. Nia slumped against the cold brick wall, sliding down until she hit the ground, gasping for air, her eyes wide and fixed on her saviors. Nia pressed her back against the rough brick wall, her breath hitching in her throat like a trapped bird. The thugs were gone, but the men who had scared them off were still there. Standing in the blinding wash of the headlights, they looked less like rescuers and more like executioners. She pulled her knees to her chest, trembling. "I don't have anything," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Please, just let me go." The man on the left didn't speak. He stepped forward, his polished dress shoes splashing softly in the puddles. Nia flinched, turning her face away and throwing her hands up to protect her head. But the blow never came. Instead, the air around her shifted. The oppressive sense of danger evaporated, replaced by a strange, heavy silence. Nia slowly lowered her hands. The man wasn't looming over her. He was bowing. It wasn't a mocking gesture, nor a casual nod. He was bent at a perfect 90-degree angle, his hands at his sides, displaying the kind of deep, unwavering respect reserved for royalty or elders. He straightened up slowly, his face impassive and unreadable. From the inside pocket of his jacket, he withdrew a thick, rectangular object. "For your trouble, Miss Nia," he said. His voice was deep, polite, and completely devoid of emotion. Nia stared at him, paralyzed. How do you know my name?" He didn't answer. He simply extended his hand, offering the object to her. It was an envelope, but not like any she had ever seen. It was made of heavy, matte black paper, edged in shimmering gold leaf. It looked alien in the dirty, trash-strewn alleyway, a piece of unblemished luxury in a world of decay. With shaking fingers, Nia reached out and took it. The paper felt like velvet. The man nodded once, sharp and precise. He turned on his heel, signaling his partner. Without another word, they returned to the idling black sedan. The doors thudded shut with the solidity of a bank vault. The engine purred, the headlights swept away from her, and the car slipped back into the rainy night, disappearing as quickly and mysteriously as it had arrived. Nia was alone again, but the terror was gone, replaced by a bewildered, thrumming curiosity. She scrambled to her feet, clutching the envelope to her chest to shield it from the rain. She dragged her suitcase toward the faint orange glow of a street lamp at the end of the alley. Under the buzzing light, she turned the envelope over. There was no stamp, no address, just a wax seal stamped with the image of a roaring dragon. She broke the seal. Her breath caught in her throat. Inside was a stack of bills, crisp, fresh $100 bills. She thumbed through them, her mind struggling to comprehend the numbers. $500, $1,000, $5,000. It was more money than she made in 4 months at the diner. It was enough for rent, enough for a new apartment, enough to eat. Behind the cash was a card made of thick, ivory stock with gold lettering that caught the light. The Golden Lotus Gala. Location, the Skyfall Tower Penthouse Ballroom. Time, midnight. Below the time, handwritten in elegant, sharp ink, was a single command. Do not be late. Nia looked at the money, then at the card, and finally at the empty street where the black car had vanished. The rain soaked her skin, but for the first time that night, she didn't feel the cold. She felt the terrifying, electric pull of destiny. $5,000 was a lifeline, but right now, it felt like a ticking clock. Nia moved through the city in a daze, the adrenaline of the alleyway attack slowly fatting into a nervous, vibrating energy. She found a 24-hour boutique in Gangnam that was still open, the kind of place she had walked past 1,000 times but never dared to enter. The salesgirl looked at Nia's soaked cardigan and mud-splattered tights with undisguised suspicion, her hand hovering near the silent alarm button. But when Nia pulled a crisp stack of bills from the black envelope, the suspicion evaporated, replaced by a predatory eagerness. Nia didn't look at the price tags. She didn't have time to bargain. She picked a silk dress the color of the midnight sky, simple, elegant, and devoid of the flashy sequins that covered the mannequins. It was the only thing that made her feel like herself, just better. A quick stop at a nearby hotel to shower away the grime of the alley, and the transformation was complete. When she stepped back onto the street, the reflection in the shop window stopped her dead. The exhausted, broken waitress was gone. In her place stood a woman who looked like she held secrets. The dress draped over her frame perfectly, the dark blue fabric shimmering under the neon lights. She looked strong. She looked dangerous. But inside, she was terrified. She hailed a taxi to the address on the card, the Skyfall Tower. It was the tallest building in Seoul, a needle of glass and steel piercing the clouds. As the taxi pulled up to the entrance, Nia's stomach dropped. The driveway was a parade of Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, and limousines. Her yellow taxi looked like a toy car in a convoy of tanks. She stepped out, clutching her small clutch bag, the only thing she had kept from her old life. The air here smelled different, expensive perfume, exhaust from high-end engines, and the crisp scent of money. A crowd had gathered at the velvet ropes. Paparazzi flashed cameras, and beautiful people preened for the lenses. As Nia approached the line, the atmosphere shifted. A woman in a silver gown, her neck dripping with diamonds, looked Nia up and down with a sneer. "Service entrance is around the back, dear," she said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. Her partner, a man in a tuxedo who looked like he owned half the block, laughed. "Security is slipping tonight, letting anyone wander up to the red carpet." Nia felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She lowered her head, the imposter syndrome crushing her chest. They're right, she thought. I'm just a waitress, I'm nobody. She reached the front of the line. The head of security, a massive man with an earpiece and a face like carved granite, held up a hand to stop her. "Private event," he grunted, not even meeting her eyes. "Invitation only, move along." Behind her, the woman in the silver gown sighed loudly. "Finally, get her out of the way." Nia's hand trembled as she reached into her bag. She pulled out the black envelope with the gold trim. She didn't speak, she just held it out. The guard glanced at it dismissively, but then he froze. His eyes widened as he saw the gold dragon seal stamped on the front. He looked at the card, then at Nia, his face draining of color. The hostility vanished instantly. He didn't just step aside, he bowed. It was a low, sweeping bow of absolute deference. He unhooked the velvet rope himself, ignoring the outraged gasps of the couple behind her. "My apologies, ma'am," he said, his voice loud enough for the snooty woman to hear. He gestured to the open doors with a trembling hand. "We have been expecting you. Please go right in. The master is waiting." The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing a world that felt less like a party and more like a gathering of predators. The Skyfall Tower ballroom was a cavern of gold leaf and velvet, illuminated by crystal chandeliers that dripped light like diamonds. But beneath the luxury, there was a razor-sharp edge to the atmosphere. The men didn't stand like politicians or businessmen. They stood like soldiers, their tuxedo jackets straining over concealed holsters. The women were beautiful but guarded, their eyes scanning the room with calculated precision. Nia stepped onto the plush carpet, her heart hammering against her ribs. She clutched her small bag, feeling like a rabbit who had wandered into a den of lions. She moved through the crowd, keeping her head low, searching for a familiar face. Who had sent the car? Who had given her the money? Every time she made eye contact with someone, she expected to be thrown out, but they simply looked at her with mild, dangerous curiosity before turning back to their hushed conversations. She needed water. Her throat was parched from nerves. She scanned the room for the bar and froze. Near the buffet tables, barking orders at a terrified young server, was a man she knew all too well. Mr. Gred. He was sweating through his cheap tuxedo, his face flushed red as he rearranged a tray of canapés with aggressive, jerky movements. He was catering the event. The irony twisted in Nia's stomach. The man who had fired her for eating a sandwich was now serving the city's most dangerous elite. Nia turned to flee, desperate to blend back into the shadows, but she wasn't fast enough. Mr. Gred looked up. His beady eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed into a slits of pure, unadulterated rage. He dropped the tray of silver spoons he was holding. They clattered loudly onto the table, drawing a few annoyed glances from nearby guests. He stormed across the floor, wiping his greasy hands on his pants. "You," he hissed, his voice rising above the polite murmur of the room. "What the hell do you think you're doing here?" Nia took a step back, her back hitting a marble pillar. "Mr. Gred, please, I was invited." "Invited?" Gred let out a sharp, mocking laugh that sounded like a bark. "Don't lie to me, you little thief. You think because you put on a fancy dress you can sneak into a place like this. Who did you steal that from? Or did you pick it out of the trash like your dinner?" He was getting louder. People were starting to turn. The dangerous men in the charcoal suits stopped talking and watched, their expressions unreadable. "I have an invitation," Nia said, her voice shaking but firm. She tried to reach into her bag, but Gred swiped at her hand. "I don't want to see your forged garbage," Gred shouted. He was enjoying this. He wanted to humiliate her, to crush the little bit of dignity she had managed to scrape together. "You're a waitress, a fired, homeless waitress. You don't belong here. You're staining the carpet." He reached out and grabbed her upper arm, his fingers digging into her flesh through the silk of her dress. "Let go of me," Nia cried out, struggling against his grip. "I'm doing this venue a favor," Gred spat, looking around for support. "Security, someone get over here. I've caught a trespasser. Get this trash out of here before she steals the silverware." He yanked her forward, dragging her toward the service exit. Nia stumbled, her heels slipping on the polished floor. Tears of humiliation pricked her eyes. It was happening again. No matter how hard she tried, no matter how kind she was, the world just wanted to chew her up and spit her out. "Let go," she screamed, panic rising. "Shut up and move," Gred growled, pulling harder. Suddenly, the music stopped. It didn't fade out. It cut off instantly, as if the orchestra had been silenced by a blade. A hush fell over the ballroom, so profound and sudden that the sound of Gred's heavy breathing seemed to echo off the walls. Gred froze, sensing the shift in the air. He didn't look at the doors. He looked at the faces of the guests. They weren't looking at him anymore. They were all looking past him, toward the main entrance, with expressions of absolute terror. The silence in the ballroom was heavy, pressing down like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. Even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. Then the massive double doors at the far end of the room groaned. They didn't open. They were pushed wide with a force that sent them slamming against the walls with a thunderous crack that made the crystal chandeliers tremble. A man stepped into the light. It was Kim Tae-Sook. But this was not the shivering, ragged creature from the alley. This man was a god of war dressed in Italian silk. He wore a tuxedo of midnight black, tailored so sharply it could cut glass. His hair, previously matted with grime, was slicked back, revealing a face of striking, brutal beauty. A long, thin scar ran down his left cheekbone, a souvenir of violence that only added to his dangerous allure. He stood at the top of the short staircase, surveying the room. He didn't look like a guest. He looked like the owner. No, he looked like the predator who owned the jungle. Behind him, 6 men in identical suits fanned out, their hands clasped loosely in front of them, their eyes scanning the crowd for threats. But no one moved. The dangerous men and elegant women who had filled the room with chatter moments ago were now frozen, heads bowed slightly in deference. This was the dragon of the north. This was the king. Tae-Sook didn't acknowledge the crowd. His dark eyes swept the room with laser focus, ignoring the bowing elites, until they landed on a scene near the buffet table. He saw the overturned tray. He saw the crying woman in the blue dress, and he saw the sweating, red-faced man gripping her arm. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Tae-Sook began to walk. His stride was long and predatory, the sound of his dress shoes echoing in the terrified silence. The crowd parted for him instantly, like the Red Sea, people scrambling to get out of his path. Mr. Gred, who had been shouting so confidently just seconds ago, went pale. His mouth opened and closed like a fish on dry land. He knew who this was. Everyone knew who this was, but his brain couldn't process why the king of the soul underworld was walking directly toward him. Tae-Sook stopped 3 feet away. He towered over Gred, radiating a menacing aura that made the caterer's knees knock together. Tae-Sook didn't look at Gred immediately. First, he looked at Nia. His gaze softened for a fraction of a second, taking in her terrified expression, her beautiful dress, and the bruise forming on her arm where Gred's fingers were digging in. Then his eyes snapped to Gred's hand. The softness vanished. His face became a mask of pure, unadulterated violence. "Take your hand off my guest," Tae-Sook said. His voice wasn't loud. It was a low, velvet baritone that carried perfectly through the silent room. It was the kind of voice that didn't need to shout to be obeyed. It was the voice of a man who could end a life with a snap of his fingers. Gred whimpered. His hand was paralyzed with fear, still clutching Nia's arm as if his brain had disconnected from his body. "Es, sir, she." "I will not ask twice," Tae-Sook whispered, stepping closer. The menace rolling off him was physical, choking the air out of Gred's lungs. "Release her, before I remove the arm that is touching her." Gred snatched his hand back as if he had been burned. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the spilled silverware. I didn't know she was with you. She's just a waitress. She's trash." Tae-Sook tilted his head, his eyes narrowing into slits. "Trash." He reached out and gently took Nia's hand, the same hand that had offered him a sandwich in the cold rain. He pulled her slightly toward him, placing her under his protection, shielding her from the room's judgment. "You are mistaken," Tae-Sook said, his voice ringing with finality. "She is the only person in this room worthy of standing by my side." Mr. Gred's survival instinct was malfunctioning. Faced with the most dangerous man in the city, he chose the path of arrogance, desperate to justify his own cruelty. He pointed a shaking finger at Nia, his voice rising in a shrill, hysterical pitch. "You're making a mistake, sir. You don't know who this is. She isn't one of us. She's a broke, incompetent waitress I fired for stealing." He looked around the room, pleading with the silent crowd for validation. "She belongs in the gutter. She spends her breaks in the filth behind my diner, feeding the stray cats and the rats in the alley." The silence that followed was absolute. Tae-Sook didn't shout. He didn't strike the man. Instead, a slow, terrifying smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a wolf who had just trapped its prey. "I know," Tae-Sook said softly. He reached into the breast pocket of his tuxedo and pulled out a small, crumpled object. He held it up for Gred to see. It was a piece of foil wrapper, the remnants of a cheap chicken sandwich. "I was the rat," he whispered. A gasp rippled through the ballroom. Nia's breath hitched. She looked up at Tae-Sook's face, really looked at him, and stripped away the expensive suit, the styled hair, and the aura of power. Beneath it all, she saw the eyes. The same dark, intense eyes that had watched her from the shadows of the alley. The eyes she had looked into when she gave away her last meal. "You," she breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "But you were shaking." Tae-Sook turned to her, and the ice in his gaze melted into something profoundly gentle. "I was undercover. I was hunting a traitor in my organization, looking for the one thing money cannot buy, loyalty. I sat in that alley for 3 days. Hundreds of people walked past me, wealthy people, powerful people." He turned back to Gred, his voice hardening into steel. "They spat on me. They ignored me. You, Mr. Gred, kicked dirt onto my shoes when you took the trash out." Gred's knees gave way. He collapsed to the floor, a puddle of terror in a cheap tuxedo. "Sir, I didn't know." "But she stopped," Tae-Sook continued, his voice ringing through the hall like a judgment bell. "She had nothing. Her bank account was empty. She was cold. She was hungry. And yet she looked at a stranger who could offer her nothing in return, and she broke her own bread." He looked down at the cowering manager. "You fired her for an act of charity that puts every person in this room to shame." Tae-Sook raised his hand and snapped his fingers. The sound cracked through the air like a whip. 2 of his security guards materialized from the shadows. They didn't need instructions. They hoisted Mr. Gred off the floor by his armpits as he began to sob and beg. "Get him out of my city," Tae-Sook commanded, dismissing him with a wave of his hand. "And ensure he never holds a position of authority over another human being again." As Gred's wails faded into the distance, dragged out the service entrance he had tried to force Nia through, Tae-Sook turned his full attention back to her. The room was still watching, but Tae-Sook made it feel like they were the only 2 people in the world. He took both of her rough, work-worn hands in his own. "Nia," he said, saying her name like it was a title of nobility. "When I was nothing, you gave me your last meal. You saved me when I was invisible." He stepped closer, his eyes promising a future she couldn't yet comprehend. "Now," he whispered, "let me give you the world." The doors thudded shut, sealing the noise of Mr. Gred's pathetic pleading outside. The ballroom remained suspended in a stunned silence, 1,000 eyes fixed on the couple standing in the center of the floor. Kim Tae-Sook didn't care about the eyes. He adjusted his cuff, his composure perfectly restored, and bent his elbow, offering his arm to Nia. It was a gesture of old-world chivalry, a stark contrast to the violence he had just commanded. "Shall we?" he asked, his voice low and intimate. "Dinner is waiting, and I believe you are hungry." Nia looked at the arm offered to her. An hour ago, she had been dragging a broken suitcase through the rain, convinced her life was over. Now, the most powerful man in Seoul was waiting for her to lead the way. She reached out, her hand still trembling slightly, and looped her arm through his. The fabric of his tuxedo was smooth, but beneath it, his arm felt like iron. He was a pillar of strength, and for the first time in years, Nia felt something she had almost forgotten: safety. "Yes," she whispered. Tae-Sook signaled to the conductor with a barely perceptible nod. The orchestra, terrified into obedience, immediately began to play a sweeping, elegant waltz. They began to walk. It wasn't just a walk, it was a procession. As they moved toward the raised VIP platform at the far end of the room, the crowd parted instantly. The same socialites who had looked at Nia with disdain now lowered their eyes in deference. The woman in the silver gown who had mocked her at the entrance was staring at the floor, clutching her champagne glass so hard her knuckles were white, terrified of drawing the dragon's attention. Nia held her head high. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the woman chosen by the king. They ascended the steps to the private table that overlooked the entire ballroom. The city's skyline of Seoul glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind them, a sea of lights that seemed to bow to their height. Tae-Sook pulled out the velvet chair for her. As Nia sat, she looked out over the room. The fear was gone. The hunger was gone. The cold was a distant memory. She looked at Tae-Sook as he took his seat beside her, his dark eyes fixed solely on her face, ignoring the empire he ruled to focus on the woman who had saved him. He poured her a glass of water himself, placing it gently in front of her. "Eat, Nia," he said softly. "You will never be hungry again." Nia smiled, a true, radiant smile that outshone the diamonds in the room. She was no longer the girl scraping plates. She was the queen of the night. She thought she was losing everything, but she was planting a seed. In a world ruled by greed, generosity is the only currency that never loses its value.